Thank you, Jim, for your very kind introduction, and it's certainly a pleasure to be back in Orlando for this year's ITSEC conference. I'd like to thank you and Linda Brent and Barbara McDaniel and the other NHTSA staff for coordinating this year's event. John came close to violating a speaker's rule, that is, be careful what you say about someone who speaks after you in the program. He didn't violate the rules, so I don't have to get back at him. Much has been said about Randy Forbes. I don't think you can say enough about his leadership on modeling and simulation. He was on the way here. His plane got canceled, got a later flight. Then before he got on, it occurred to him that his connecting flight would have left by the time he got to Charlotte, so he tried to get here but just couldn't make it. He looks forward to this every year and has provided just such leadership on modeling and simulation that I know he's disappointed that he's not here today. John Micah represents Orlando, which is a hotbed of activity in modeling and simulation, and Randy and I represent Southeast Virginia, whose districts include citizens, businesses, and colleges, have been in the lead of modeling and simulation. Military assets throughout Southeast Virginia utilize modeling and simulation for simulated battlefield and training and piloting ships and planes. And in Fort Lee, you can learn welding and modeling and simulation. We also have universities, Old Dominion University, Norfolk State, Hampton University, facilities like NASA Langley Research, Jefferson Lab, and Newport News Shipbuilding all use a lot of modeling and simulation and expanded modeling and simulation technology. Modeling and simulation has become critical to our nation. This technology allows us to build and develop models of complex systems, whether it's a car, a plane, entire battlefield, a major city's evacuation plan, even the human body, to see how certain actions can affect the end result. The United States military has been using this technology for decades. The Manhattan Project developed the atom bomb using some of the earliest modeling and simulation to replicate the nuclear reaction process. We've seen, as John mentioned, a lot of the exhibits downstairs. One showed how you could invest $10 million in modeling and simulation and avoid about $750 million in avoided cost. I know a few years ago, Randy and I flew a jumbo jet. Okay, I wrecked it. But instead of having to repair the jumbo jet, all you had to do was reboot the computer, saving a lot of money every time someone goes off the runway and wrecks the jet. The healthcare industry has increased the quality and lowered the cost of healthcare. Medical students use this technology to simulate complicated medical procedures. Hospitals use modeling and simulation to efficiently deliver their health care. City planners use modeling and simulation to determine traffic patterns and how to reduce congestion, how to develop evacuation plans. Speaking of transportation, one of the exhibits downstairs, as John mentioned, showed how you can teach people how to inspect tunnels and bridges using modeling and simulation. They don't have to do it on the job. They can do it in modeling and simulation, so when they get on the job, they know what they're doing. John mentioned the defense reauthorization. We also had a transportation reauthorization recently. And understanding how critically important modeling and simulation is, Randy Forbes and I offered an amendment stating that it was the sense of Congress that the Department of Transportation should utilize modeling and simulation technology to analyze federally funded highway and public transit projects to ensure that those projects will increase transportation capacity and safety, reduce travel time and environmental impact, alleviate congestion, and be as cost-effective as practical. That amendment was offered, and it actually passed by a voice vote, and we expect it to be included in the final conference committee report. Now, we have limited federal resources for transportation projects, and it's critical that we know that the federal dollars are being used as widely as possible, and the passage of this amendment will make sure that happens in transportation. We have budget challenges that John mentioned. Sequestration has become an annual part of that challenge, and getting the most out of every dollar has become a necessity. Now, we passed that sequestration. Some say we never expected it to happen, but if you look at the arithmetic, the alternative was finding surgically, not across the board, but surgically surgical cuts that amounted to over $1 trillion. The fact of the matter is you can't cut $1 trillion out of the budget. Nobody would want to be associated with a budget that found that level of cuts. Programs would have to be eliminated altogether. Others would be so devastated as to cut people off of services. And so the only way you can really find about $1 trillion in cuts is it's not my fault, 10% across the board. When people come and say, well, what happened to money? It wasn't my fault, it was across the board, rather than, okay, I voted for the budget that cut your budget 10% or 20%, because there's some you're going to find you can't afford to cut, so you got to double up on the next one. Sequestration has become, unfortunately, the law of the land. We did pass a budget, a 2-year budget, and I call it the dancing bear budget. Dancing bear, it's not so much that he did it well, but that he did it at all. It's not so much that we have a good budget, but that we have a budget at all. The fact of the matter is that a lot of people didn't think we'd even be able to pass a budget, and we did, so we just have something to work with. We can afford, fact is, we can afford transportation and national defense and education and health care and all the other spending, and we can afford massive tax cuts. But you just arithmetically, you can't do both. You've got to make a decision. There's a minister that was addressing his congregation, and he said, I've got good news, but I've got bad news. The good news is we have enough money to build the new church. The bad news is most of that money is still in your pockets. We have enough money to do all we want to do, but if we spend it all in tax cuts, we're not going to have that money left over. And so we have to make a choice what we're going to do, and every time we pass a tax cut, we have to recognize that we're going to have some spending cuts to go along with it, and that's where modeling and simulation can be very helpful, because that means the money that's left can get stretched as far as possible. Now, since I talked to you last, I've become the ranking Democrat on the Education and Workforce Committee, and that's very important to modeling and simulation. Just recently, or as we speak, we're in the process of reauthorizing the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Last reauthorized is No Child Left Behind. We're about 8 years behind in reauthorizing it, and I think we've finally gotten to that point. And we have a bill that I think will go a long way in addressing inequities in education. When that was first passed, it was trying to deal with the fact that the Brown v. Board of Education had established a right to education. It said that no child can reasonably be expected to succeed in life if denied the opportunity of an education. Such an opportunity must be made available to all on equal terms. But we don't have equal education because we fund it with the real estate tax, which guarantees that wealthy areas will have more for education than low-income areas. And just the give and take in politics, you know who's going to get the short end of the stick. So we passed, 50 years ago this year, we passed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act to give funding to those areas to meet the challenges of educating low-income students, particularly in high areas, high concentration of poverty. And we've been going along with that, and we've, No Child Left Behind added on the requirement that you have to find achievement gaps and do something about it. Well, unfortunately, there were so many problems with No Child Left Behind, we needed to cure the problems, but we didn't want to take a step back. And I think this reauthorization will provide the ability to identify the achievement gaps, do something about it, put the money where the money is needed, and also make sure we fund STEM education to make sure that the next generation will be able to fill the jobs that you have in modeling and simulation. Next thing on the agenda would be the Higher Education Act, where we again have to deal with making sure that we have the workers that can fill the positions that you have. Last reauthorization, we had a provision in there, the Department of Education should develop a curriculum so that if somebody, college curriculum, so if somebody can graduate in a modeling and simulation degree and you would know what they know. Unfortunately, the Department of Education has been somewhat lackadaisical in that, and so when we reauthorize Higher Education Act in my position as the ranking Democrat on the Education and Workforce Committee, I'll be in a position to try to encourage them to do a little better this time. But if we're going to have, if we're successful in elementary and secondary education and higher education, we'll have the workforce necessary to fill the positions that you have in modeling and simulation. Now, the men and women in this room, make sure, as John mentioned, you want to make sure your voices are heard. You don't have to convince Randy Forbes or John Mike or me about the importance of modeling and simulation to our nation, but we have to convince our colleagues to make sure that we make these cost-effective investments. And so I want to thank you again for inviting me to participate in the conference. I came not really to speak, but to listen to your concerns and suggestions as to what Congress can do to promote modeling and simulation technology. You've already provided huge benefits to our nation in the fields of science, national defense, healthcare, homeland security, disaster planning, education, and a lot of others, and there's still potential for a lot more benefits. So I'm glad that you're here to share your knowledge and expertise in this rapidly changing industry, and I look forward to today's discussion on how we can further enhance modeling and simulation in our nation. Thank you very much.
Okay, we're going to go into our interactive session now with question and answers for Congressman Scott. Linda Brent is walking the halls. If you found one of these on your seats, have a question, if you just make it succinct, only one side of the page would be good. No political, be politically correct, if you will, and certainly polite. Before we start, I'd like to recognize John Bacon from Congressman Forbes' office. And we have two folks here from Senator Rubio's office. Would you please stand up? We just want to highlight these. If you want to talk to them afterwards, they'll be available.
John, stand up.
John, you stand up. And anyway, you can recognize them now, and they're here representing their particular offices, and we appreciate them being here. As we get started, I know you all have a lot of questions. Primarily, the industry folks in the audience, Congressman Scott, there's always this tension between how much money and what's in it for us, but also the possibility of any kind of BRAC kind of issues. Have you heard anything about BRAC potentials or discussions in that area?
Every time BRAC comes up, I think there are enough people who have bases in or near their districts that we almost routinely put an anti-BRAC amendment in defense. And I think the chance of a BRAC anytime soon is remote. The problem, the last time BRAC came up, they said that we could save present value $10 billion if we had another round of BRAC. $10 billion. We passed, a couple of years ago, we passed a tax cut of $3.9 trillion. I mean, so this wouldn't even be a good drop in the bucket compared to what we are doing in spending. You have to also look at, if it's only $10 billion, I suspect that states and localities will spend that much in lobbying fees to protect themselves from a BRAC. I mean, just the idea of a BRAC inflicts economic terrorism on a community. I know Fort Lee was put on a BRAC list. Prince George County, right nearby, had a bond issue floating at the time, and their bond counsel told them to suspend the bond issue until after the BRAC. We didn't think they were going to close Fort Lee, but the fact that it was a possibility meant that they would have had to put that on the bond issue as a economic possibility, and their interest on the bonds would go up. Well, that's the kind of, so they had to spend a lot of lobbyists trying to fight it, and so I'm not sure overall how much savings there would be in another BRAC. By the time you have to actually spend some money, they closed Fort Monroe. Half the people ended up 20 miles up the street at Fort Eustis, half the rest about 80 miles away in Fort Lee, and the rest were kind of dispersed. I'm not sure after they spent money closing Fort Monroe, I don't know if they've saved any money yet. That's been several years back. And so you save so little, with relatively speaking, you save so little, and you cause so much havoc with people's lives that I think the chance of any meaningful BRAC round, I think, is negligible.
Okay, thank you very much. Couple of questions here related to the caucus. What's your view of how the caucus has done over the years and how we might be able to help build that agenda and execute in terms of supporting modeling simulation?
Well, one thing, it would be very helpful if people here would call your representatives and ask them to become a member of the caucus. There's no, now sometimes when you join a caucus, it costs you money because they have significant staff, and so you got to pay for it, so signing up actually costs you money. This one doesn't cost money, so that you can join for free, and there's no downside. It's not a caucus that's going to get you into political trouble. And so a request from home, particularly as you indicate your local interest in modeling and simulation and local economic interest in modeling and simulation, you could significantly increase the caucus membership. The caucus has programs during the year up in Washington where many of you come up to do the same kind of displays that you've got downstairs, which kind of alerts people to modeling and simulation as an industry. But I think another thing you can do is emphasize to people how much money you can save. Because as we look to try to do these budgets, saving a little money can go a long way in stretching the little money that's left after the budget comes down. And when you can show how a little investment in your business can save a significant amount of money, that gets everybody's attention.
Okay. Sir, you've got high credentials in the education area, obviously, and been a great supporter in that area. We have our 10th year or our serious game competition here at ITSEC this year, which emphasizes educational content within a gaming industry. Do you have any thoughts on how that serious game sort of mindset might sort of work its way into the education system?
I'd like to hear what the suggestions are on that, because it's a very exciting idea that you can get modeling and simulation. They're doing a lot in, it's different from the normal situation. You get a classroom full of kids and teachers sitting up front delivering the message. They're doing a lot of online activities where one person can give a lecture and people can watch it on the screen, a lot of online learning. So there's a lot that I think we can do in terms of modeling and simulation. I don't have the suggested specifics, but to the extent that you can show how in modeling and simulation you can help the education process, that would be helpful. I mean, the kids growing up now are right at home with all these games, and if you can have an educational component to that, I think the learning could take place a lot faster.
Yes, sir. Okay, sir, a couple of questions here related to using modeling and simulation within the government structure to help analyze the budget. Do you see where we might be able to model and simulate our way into a balanced budget?
That is so far from where we are now. I don't, you're talking about modeling and simulation. I don't think these guys are using arithmetic. You know, the budget is about choices, and one of the problems is that we do things kind of sequentially without recognizing choices that are being made. People are talking about, and if you listen very carefully to the budget discussions, one thing you'll find noticeably absent are numbers. I mean, people just kind of talk in generalities and themes and philosophy and never get to numbers. I mean, you do things like Increase the exemption on the estate tax. After $2 million, people start paying money on estates, husband and wife. Then we moved it up to $7 million when you start paying, then up to $10 million. Well, if you look at just going from 7 to 10 was $135 billion. They're talking about, well, we have to cut Social Security. Well, the main strategy there is to cut the cost of living and what they call the chain CPI, basically reduce the cost of living. And if you do that, you get $125 billion. Well, let's choose. We're going to increase the exemption to help some what I call dead multimillionaires and pay for it by whacking everybody's Social Security. Well, nobody would be for that. But if you do it sequentially, you increase the exemption on the estate tax, then you're broke. You got to go find some money. You might end up cutting Social Security. Well, let's get it all on the table and then make the choice. And that's one thing, you don't have to, modeling and simulation might help, because as you make one choice, you'll find that you don't have anything left over for your other choices. And that process could be extremely helpful, but I think you have a threshold challenge in getting people to actually just sit down and recognize that choices are being made and we're dealing with arithmetic.
Yes, sir. So in that vein, do you think, Congress has been somewhat continuing resolution centric for the last 7 years, and we've seen some progress now with actual budgets being built and passed, and also new leadership in the House. Do you see the process changing for the good a little bit?
Well, the new speaker, I don't think was, John Boehner was not the problem. John Boehner is a conscientious legislator, nice guy, gets along with everybody, but the arithmetic in his caucus was such that, if he got all his caucus supporting something, you would have things that were so extreme that they couldn't pass the Senate. And if he wanted to pass something that passed the Senate, he couldn't get all of his troops together. And and if you tried to pass things with a minority of the Republican caucus, they have a thing they call the Hastert rule. They don't expect anything to hit the floor if it doesn't have the support of a majority of the majority. Otherwise, the Democrats are controlling the Congress, and that's not a good idea from their perspective. And so he was always in a quandary, governing or keeping his seat. That arithmetic doesn't change with Paul Ryan. I mean, he's a conscientious legislator. Everybody likes him, but he's still got the same arithmetic. So I don't know how that's gonna change. I think one of the things we have to do is just come to grips with arithmetic and pass a budget. One challenge is sometimes you can pass a budget that has unrealistic numbers in it. Then when you get to appropriating, you find that as you start putting numbers on line items, some of the numbers are so small that nobody wants to be associated with it, and so you can't pass the appropriations bill under those numbers. What we did in this last appropriations is we gave a little relief on the top, and so the numbers are bad, but people can vote for the appropriations.
Right. So we got a lot of sort of chaos in the world today. We got ISIS and the Russians and the Chinese and Iranians, et cetera, that seemingly not a lot more secure than before, yet we're having pretty significant cuts in defense in terms of numbers of people in the Army and the Marines especially, as well as other cuts. How do you see this playing out over time? Are these cuts going to hold, or is the reality of the necessity for national defense in extraordinary times maybe have some influence on that? You have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's nobody more articulate in the need for spending money on national defense than Randy Forbes. He's pointed out that as you start trooping on the numbers, there's some things you can't do. When you try to fit your military under a budget, rather than figuring out what you want to do and then see how much it costs, you get some inefficiencies. think we've gotten to the point where this is the money you got, you do the best you can with it, is not a very effective way to deal with the real challenges we have. Some of the challenges, money, I mean, buying more aircraft carriers and submarines isn't going to protect us from people that'll hide in the bushes and jump out and shoot people in what they call asymmetric warfare. They're not combating the aircraft carriers and submarines. To the extent that there's hatred around the world, we're going to have problems. And I think we need to, I'm proud that Southeast Virginia is not only home to a lot of military operations, it's also home to Operation Smile and Physicians for Peace. I think if we sent them out a little more, it would help us as much as sending out some dropping bombs on people. It just tend to make them more madder than they were. They're a group of people that there's not much you can do but try to find them and kill them. But they have to operate somewhere, and to the extent that they have sympathy in the area and sympathy for those around them, they can operate. And to the extent that we can reduce the hatred some kind of way, we can make it more difficult for them to operate.
So related to those cuts in the Army and Marines specifically, are there things we can do to help the transitions of those folks into the civilian world?
Well, we've got a lot of jobs programs that help veterans try to find jobs. And they're not as efficient as we'd like them to be, but Virginia's been very successful in getting veterans jobs. We have probably more veterans than any other per capita, I think, than any other state. If we're not number one, we're close to it. And so the Democrats and Republicans look at that as a very high priority.
So what do you see in terms of cybersecurity and the threats that are appearing, and what's your thought on that as a national security issue?
It's obviously a national security issue. I mean, we don't notice a lot of the vulnerabilities we have until something goes wrong. When a computer goes wrong in an energy plant, a nuclear plant, or an energy plant, and everybody loses their electricity, all of a sudden that network becomes very important, and people don't pay attention to it because the networks generally work. But you get somebody jumping into a banking computer and can take out massive amounts of money. There's so many vulnerabilities that we have to stay on top of it. The Department of Defense say that they're being attacked cyber-wise. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of hits, people trying to get in. And so we have to make sure that we do everything we possibly can. I don't know that there's ever enough, but we've got to do as much as we can, and I think this organization can be helpful in making sure we're doing what we can.
Sure. So we see sort of a wall growing between commercial digital world and the government digital world. For example, Microsoft and some of the Apple kind of companies don't necessarily want to do business with the government, but they're spending an awful lot of money on augmented reality, virtual reality kind of systems, specifically for commercial gaming and other. Do you have any thoughts about how we can bridge this gap? Because the commercial side is going so fast. Your iPhone's going, every 18 months you get a new edition, and the government acquisition side tends to be not so fast. Is there a chance we're going, the commercial side is just going to run away from us?
Well, one of the problems you have on the commercial side is the issue of privacy. If you allow government intrusion into kind of back doors and that kind of thing, on a worldwide basis, people won't want to buy it. And so there's always tension between the private sector selling on a global market and our national security allowing government access to the information that's floating out there. You're never going to get that perfect, and that's going to be an ongoing debate. And I think that's one of if we can get that straight, I think we can go a long way in solving that challenge. But private sector is always going to be the private sector. The government's just got to catch up. A lot of stuff that we saw that you'll see downstairs is just off the shelf. The computer screens, and these aren't homemade. I mean, these are just off the shelf stuff. And most of the hardware is off the shelf, and the software you have to develop. And that's really the main product. But a lot of the hardware is just off the shelf, and so we're using the private sector from that perspective.
Okay. Anybody else had a question out there? We're almost at our time limit. I think it would be a couple themes that I see in ITSEC this year, Congressman, related to some of the things you talk about, is that we have an energy kind of session on Wednesday, which discusses plant security and the use of modeling and simulation in electric power grids and things like that you discussed. And on Thursday, we're going to introduce our Black Swan theme. Black Swan being the good or bad things that happen in low frequency but high impact. And we think modeling simulation and analysis of those kind of scenarios using modeling simulation has great potential. So these are some things actually that were inspired by the Caucus at Leadership Summit a couple of years ago that we're trying to put into effect here and actually move on.
Well, Randy and I live in Southampton Roads, which is an area where modeling and simulation is warning us about sea level rise and what happens if you get an extra couple of inches and what happens to the land area. You've got military has an interest in that because you've got the Norfolk Naval Base and a lot of other military assets. It's interesting. There's one theory that says that don't worry about it. Sometimes it rains and you get wet. Just move all the computers up to the second floor and don't worry about it. Once every couple of years, it's gonna flood. That's a little distressing strategy, but but the modeling and simulation can give you the can tell you what you're dealing with.
You can simulate. Okay, well, thank you, and please help me thank Congressman Scott. He's going to be here for a couple of minutes afterwards. But really appreciate it.